Hello, and welcome back to another Explainer. Today we're diving into a slice of history that honestly sounds almost too absurd to be true. I mean, imagine this. A profit-obsessed multinational trading company that through a wild series of bribes, battles, and just pure opportunism accidentally turns into a massive empire. And suddenly they're in charge of millions of people. But here's the real kicker we're focusing on today. What happens when that exact same greedy corporation is suddenly put in charge of an entire criminal justice system? Well, as you're about to see, the results were an absolute on-the-ground nightmare. So, we're going to trace this whole hubris arc today. We'll start with part 1, from merchants to landlords. Then part 2, the ultimate corporate loophole. Part 3, taking over the system. Part 4, a chaotic criminal justice. And finally, we'll end with part 5, the mud and straw gales. All right, let's jump right into section 1, from merchants to landlords. It's absolutely dizzying how fast this company grew. Let's trace this out. Back in 1698, they were basically nobodies, right? They were just renting 3 little villages, Sutanadi, Calcutta, and Govindapur, for a paltry 1,200 rupees a year. They actually had to rely on bribery just to have basic police powers over their own tiny local area. But then, fast forward to 1757 after the Battle of Plassey, suddenly, boom, they become landlords of nearly 900 square miles of territory. And then the real tipping point hits in 1765 when the Mughal emperor grants them the Diwani. In less than a human lifetime, they went from being insignificant little tenants to literal provincial overlords. Now wrap your head around this number, 234,000 pounds. That was the instant, massive personal fortune that Robert Clive walked away with after that 1757 coup. To put that insane wealth into perspective for you, his official annual salary from those newly acquired territories was only about 30,000 pounds. Clive literally became one of the wealthiest people in all of England overnight. And meanwhile, the company's agents were just swarming the region, doing business at enormous personal profit and getting away with not paying a single rupee back into local taxes. It was just an era of total unprecedented wealth extraction. Which brings us to section 2, the ultimate corporate loophole. To understand how they actually pulled this scam off, we really need to quickly define 2 crucial Mughal terms. First is zemindari. This basically gave them landlord status, the right to collect local revenue and run small local courts. But the holy grail was the Diwani. Securing the Diwani meant capturing the very lifeblood of the province's entire economy. The East India Company wasn't just a bunch of merchants anymore. They had the official right to run the civil administration and, most importantly, scoop up all the vast provincial tax money. So Clive sets up what he calls the dual government model, and honestly, it is the ultimate corporate loophole. Step 1, the company pockets all the immense tax revenue. Step 2, they pay the emperor and the local nawab these relatively small fixed annual allowances. And step 3, this is the crazy part. They leave the completely underfunded nawab strictly responsible for the nizamat. That means all the policing, all the law and order, and the entire criminal justice system. They essentially outsourced all the cost and liability of running a functional justice system while hoarding all the wealth for their own shareholders. Moving on to section 3, taking over the system. Okay. You're probably thinking they must have been rolling in cash, right? Well, the irony here is so thick you could cut it with a knife. By 1767, despite all the mind-blowing personal wealth of guys like Robert Clive, the East India Company itself reported that it was completely insolvent. They couldn't even afford to pay a promised tax of $400,000 back to the British Treasury. Because of that dual government system, nobody was actually steering the ship. The local justice system just totally collapsed, and it started relying on blatant extortion and corruption just to physically survive. Of course, this absolute mismanagement finally forces the British Parliament to wake up and intervene. They basically tell the company, enough is enough, drop the charade. They send Warren Hastings in 1772 to take over as governor. Under massive pressure from London, the company announces that it is finally going to stand forth publicly and take direct official responsibility for the administration. The hiding behind the local nawab was officially over. They had to own the broken system they created. Let's see how that went in section 4, a chaotic criminal justice. As you might guess, taking responsibility on paper is very, very different from actually doing it in reality. We see this massive, glaring gap. The official policy set up by Hastings in 1772 claimed that criminal justice would safely remain in the hands of local Muslim law officers, the qazis and muftis, and the nawab. But the on-the-ground reality? Total chaos. English functionaries stepped in to supervise everything, and because the courts were completely starved of the funds that the company was still hoarding, the whole system was just notoriously corrupt and fundamentally broken. I mean, the chaos was absolute. Let me give you a prime example of just how lawless it was. There was an incident where an ordinary company agent got into a petty argument over a simple log of wood with a local magistrate in Tirhut. So what does this agent do? He casually rounds up 400 to 500 armed men, violently raids the magistrate's office, plunders his belongings, and beats him unconscious. And during all this rioting, every single prisoner in the local jail just took the opportunity to walk out and escape. These company agents were literally acting completely above the law they were supposed to be upholding. Which leads us directly into our final and darkest section, the mud and straw gales. You know the saying, right? Show me your budget and I'll tell you what you value. Well, let's look at this actual expense report from a Mr. Evelyn in Dhaka from 1778. Just look at the absolute absurdity of their priorities. He drops 200 rupees on a house tent for himself, 100 on a clerk, and get this, 80 rupees just on candles. Meanwhile, the Gale tent, the actual facility used to hold human beings, costs a pathetic 30 rupees. They literally spent almost 3 times as much money on candles as they did on the actual prison itself. And on the rare occasions when they did bother to provide physical buildings instead of just renting cheap tents, the construction was a total nightmare. They were built as cheaply as humanly possible. We're talking basic mud walls and cheap straw-thatched roofs that were incredibly prone to catching fire. On top of that, because they refused to buy proper land, they'd stick these mud huts in low-lying, marshy areas. By 1785, it was reported that the rooms in the Kolkata town jail were heavily flooded with knee-deep water just because the floors were lower than the swampy ground outside. Inside these terrifying mud structures, the conditions were just abysmal. Since they spent zero money on proper design, there was absolutely no segregation. Innocent people who just owed a petty debt were thrown directly into tiny, shockingly overcrowded rooms right alongside hardened, dangerous criminals. And men and women were frequently locked up in the exact same room. In one place, Sylhet, the prison was so impossibly small it could only hold the debtors. So the actual criminals, they were just shoved into an abandoned, damp, rotting mosque down the street. And because these buildings were made of, well, cheap mud, nature regularly just wiped them out. The supporting posts would literally rot away in the marshy ground. Take May 1790, for example. A violent gale hits Rangpur. The Diwani jail there, which, by the way, was supposed to be a newly constructed building, was completely leveled to the ground by the wind. It was literally blown away like a house of cards. That's how dangerously inadequate their engineering was. But the most terrifying consequence of cutting corners on infrastructure happened in 1789. A massive fire broke out at the jail in Chapala. Because the roofs were made of highly flammable straw and the walls were baked mud, a strong breeze quickly turned the entire prison into a roaring furnace. Out of 444 people confined there, 211 were either suffocated or literally roasted alive. By morning, the bodies were found piled half-high in the yard. It is a completely gut-wrenching, entirely preventable tragedy caused by plain, old-fashioned greed. And honestly, if the fire didn't get them, the water certainly did. Check out what happened in October 1790 at the Gaya Goal. Heavy monsoon rains came pouring down and quite literally washed the mud prison walls away. The walls just melted. The prisoners' wives had secretly brought them files, they fought off the guards in the dark, and because the actual building was dissolving into mud around them, 132 prisoners just walked out and vanished into the night. So, faced with collapsing mud walls, deadly fires, and constant mass escapes, did this massively wealthy East India Company finally decide to invest some tax money into building proper, humane stone prisons? Of course not. Their big solution, starting around 1787, was just to literally ship the problem away. Instead of spending money to fix the local infrastructure, they just began transporting convicts across the ocean to a penal settlement in Bencoolen, Sumatra, using them for brutal hard labor. As we wrap up today's explainer, I want to leave you with a question to chew on. Did the transition from a profit-driven company to a formal government truly bring justice to Bengal, or did it just bring a much more organized form of oppression? The East India Company proved that when an empire prioritizes a corporate ledger over actual human lives, the justice system doesn't just fail, it actively becomes a machine for suffering. Thanks for hanging out with me on this deep dive, and I will see you in the next explainer.